System dynamics models are particularly useful for studying policy resistance. John Sterman summarizes this idea of policy resistance in this quote. Sterman says, "All too often, well-intentioned efforts to solve pressing problems lead to policy resistance, where our policies are delayed, diluted, or defeated by the unforeseen reactions of people or of nature." In efforts to reduce obesity, we often implement policies that make sense on paper, but ultimately have no impact. In Los Angeles, for example, they banned new fast food restaurants in a part of the city, which seemed like a really good idea. But researchers found that this policy ultimately had no impact on obesity. And it can leave us scratching our heads about why this policy had no impact. I can't speak to why this particular policy did not reduce obesity, but in general, policy resistance occurs because we don't anticipate how a system will adapt to overcome whatever the policy was intended to do. And although I use the word policy, the concept can be applied to any type of intervention, whether it's a formal government law or a diet that someone is on. Policy resistance occurs in many fields throughout medicine and public health. And this slide lists just a few examples. So these are all interventions of some kind that had unintended consequences aside from what they were designed to do. Lowering nicotine levels in cigarettes, for example, has been found to lead some people to smoke more cigarettes to compensate. The overuse of antibiotics is well known to lead to antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Anti-lock brakes are a good idea, except that they can cause some drivers to actually engage in more risky driving. And it's been shown time after time that constructing more roads does not improve traffic. It can actually encourage more traffic. And we see this all the time in obesity too. There are many examples that are more relevant to obesity. Most diets, for example, fail to maintain weight loss in the long run, even if they have short-term success. Another example is when people exercise more and yet gain more weight because they overcompensate by consuming more calories. And initiatives to eliminate food deserts have had limited success so far, as studies have found that bringing healthy supermarkets into low-income areas did not affect residents' diet. Now, it's a little early to say that such initiatives were a failure, but it does raise questions as to whether bringing a supermarket into a low-income area is really getting at the structural factors that influence people's diet. And I'm discussing policy resistance in this system dynamics lecture because that's really where system dynamics began. Jay Forrester, as I said earlier, he's the founder of system dynamics, and in the 1960s he worked with the former mayor of Boston to study why so many cities are persistently plagued by the same issues, such as congestion, lack of affordable housing, and unemployment. These issues are a persistent problem in many cities, no matter how hard local leaders try to solve them. Policymakers have tried to address these issues with more roads and more housing and more jobs, but the problems often remain, and they've really ruined a lot of cities. Forrester, though, he developed a system dynamics model to explain why this policy resistance occurs, and he published the model in his seminal book, Urban Dynamics. Now, it's impossible to capture the entire model here, but I'll give an overview of the model and the results that came out of it. Briefly, the model included three interrelated stocks of population, housing, and businesses. And Forrester demonstrated how the growth of these stocks is ultimately limited by a city's size or capacity. A city can attract people and develop new businesses for many years, but eventually it faces problems of overcrowding and congestion, other factors that make the city less attractive. Forrester used simulations to show why creating new jobs or constructing new houses often can't overcome this structural barrier to growth. So let's say, for example, that a city's population is shrinking and they face high unemployment. So the city leaders implement some type of policy or program to create more jobs. Forrester's model showed that this might temporarily lower the unemployment rate and trigger a brief rebound in the population, but eventually unemployment returns to its previous level and the population declines again. Again, that's because targeting a single variable like unemployment can't change the structure of a system. Policy resistance often occurs when we take an exogenous approach to a complex problem like obesity, and I'll explain what I mean by that in more detail. Policy resistance occurs when we focus only on events or specific variables instead of thinking about the underlying structure. We see an event and we think that one thing caused it. So for example, let's say I'm walking home from work one day and I just get hit by a bus. Our instinct is to see that as an exogenous event. I mean, I got hit by a bus. Is there really anything endogenous or structural about that? It's one specific thing that had a direct effect on another specific thing. Most people would chalk that up as a stupid pedestrian like me or a careless driver and think that you just need to find the pedestrian or discipline the driver and everything will be fine. But there could be other endogenous factors at play here. Maybe I was crossing the street in an unsafe place because there were no crosswalks due to how the city's built. Or maybe the bus driver is forced to work exceptionally long shifts and was tired. And either of those explanations is more of a systematic problem. If those are true, then this wasn't an isolated event, and the problem is likely to repeat itself. Policy resistance occurs when you focus on that single event rather than the underlying structure. An iceberg is often used as a metaphor to represent this idea. An iceberg consists of a relatively small amount of ice above the surface and a much larger mass of ice underneath the surface. We tend to focus on what's above the surface, which are the specific events. We push on those by targeting individual events or individual variables, and we don't think about the enormous mass of structural factors that are underneath the surface. A pendulum is also a common metaphor to represent policy resistance. Pulling a pendulum to one side changes the appearance of a system, but the underlying dynamics that govern the system are still there. If you let that pendulum go, it will swing back and forth for a little while, but eventually it settles right back where it was. Just like when you focus on one thing in a system, it will eventually return to its usual behavior. And that's what you see all the time in fad diets, when a person loses weight initially, but eventually returns to their original weight. Targeting one variable within a complex system does not change the structure that contributed to that problem in the first place. This quote from the System Dynamics Society website also sums it up perfectly. They say, exogenous disturbances are seen at most of triggers of system behavior. The causes are contained within the structure of the system itself. Many experts believe that we've struggled to reduce obesity because we implement exogenous interventions that only trigger system behavior. Educating people about nutrition and physical activity, for example, that does not change neighborhoods or social systems or food prices or any of the other systematic determinants of obesity that we're discussing in this course. Now, I want to go back to the idea of goals, which I talked about at the beginning. Another important factor that leads to policy resistance is goals, because every system has a goal that it's trying to achieve. And when a system is thrown off from achieving its goal, it will typically adapt in whatever way it needs to. In the case of Forrester's urban dynamics model, people had a basic goal to live a comfortable life. And if a city's growth begins to disrupt that goal, then people will adapt by moving away. In the case of obesity, interventions are often ineffective if they disrupt some system from achieving its goal. And remember, interventions are often implemented in the context of other complex systems that have goals of their own. And interventions may have the goal to reduce obesity, but if they're implemented in a system that has other goals, then this can be detrimental to their effect. And a perfect example of this is efforts to promote physical activity in schools. A lot of experts have called for requiring physical education in schools as a way to promote activity. But as I found in my research, PE requirements often have a limited impact. And even if they're successful when implemented, PE has still been cut substantially in recent decades. And one of the reasons for this is that PE takes place within a system, a school system, that has goals of its own. A school system's goal is to educate kids. And if PE is viewed as detrimental to those goals, then schools often don't want to invest time or money into it. So to promote physical activity more effectively, we need to understand the goals of a school system. And that's why many experts have called for a different approach to activity promotion, what's known as a whole of school approach. Rather than just requiring kids to attend PE class, a whole of school approach integrates physical activity throughout the school day. This can include PE, but it also includes recess, activity breaks within class, and other ways to get kids continuously moving throughout the day. Teachers often report that activity breaks improve students' attention and students' engagement levels, and studies have found that activity is positively associated with students' academic achievement. So this contrast between requiring PE versus taking a whole of school approach really represents an exogenous approach compared to a more systems-based way of thinking. Requiring PE sounds like a good idea, but it's more likely to face resistance, especially if it's imposed from the outside. On the other hand, incorporating physical activity into the structure of a school day, that tends to face less resistance and can be more effective. So in conclusion, policy resistance typically happens because we focus too much on events and variables instead of structure. The predominant theme of this section of the course is that structure is what drives complex systems like obesity. I think obesity has grown and persisted at a high level because we focus too much on specific behaviors and specific parts of the environment instead of the overall system. I study policies related to obesity a lot, and I'll tell you, they don't work a lot of the time. Policy resistance is a widespread phenomenon in obesity research. But using system dynamics tools can help us to understand why policy resistance occurs. System dynamics can also help us to identify better approaches that will ultimately have a more successful impact on obesity.